Good morning and welcome to this episode of Focus On. I'm Gyamo Musibile. Africa's role in reaching net zero by 2050 has become more evident than ever with its abundant minerals and metals resources, which are essential to driving the shift towards cleaner energy. But another component key to realizing this goal is finances and funding. Joining me for more today to expand on the role of Africa's minerals financial institutions in driving the future of green energy forward is Shirley Weber, Managing Principal and Coverage Head for Resources and Energy Sector at Absa Corporate and Investment Banking. Shirley, thank you so much for joining us in studio. When we look back, we are 1 month plus post the mining Indaba, where there was a gathering of various industry leaders and stakeholders. When I zero in your position at helm of the position of Absa Bank in driving the green energy conversation forward, what are some of the developments that you have implemented or instituted post this event?
I think the mining Indaba is always a very good event for us to focus on maybe new avenues of driving, for example, over the last few years, the transition, to ensure that we have a better use of energy. And when I say a better use of energy, more efficient use of energy. And that then leads us to various aspects. For example, we are always financing, projects on the mining, minerals and metal space. We are financing, the energy production, for example, not just as for the country, but for power plants next to a mining operation, etc. And the one new thing that we are definitely doing is looking at the inputs into the solar panels, the inputs into the wind turbines, etc., and realizing that we have a responsibility to also fund those, because we can't just fund the projects anymore. We need to do the inputs there as well, and that then leads to a different look at commodities in the energy, minerals and metals space, which are not necessarily easy minerals and metals to finance. So it takes a bit of work and a bit of research and a bit of structuring around financing these minerals and metals.
I appreciate your input, which gives an overhead approach in terms of the role that you play in climate financing. But when we specifically look at the critical minerals, as we know, climate financing is a topic various gatherings and organizations cannot ignore in terms of the future of finance. And when we look at Africa's position, Africa holds a unique advantage in terms of having these minerals. When we ask for your input in terms of this, what is the specific strategies in place in terms of capitalizing on that opportunity?
If you look at Africa, vast critical minerals sitting on the continent. We have 54 countries, and each and every country have their own unique minerals and metals. So how we look at that is, if there's one country that only has got lithium, for example, and maybe there's a few operators that doesn't necessarily have, for example, big sponsors behind it, we need to also help with accessing equity to ensure that that project gets developed. So investment, for example, by equity partners, maybe a different way of raising capital is going to be important. And there we've seen many various geographies wanting to come into Africa to invest, but also then ensuring that wherever that investment comes from, that offtake goes back to those various jurisdictions to ensure that the equity partners can obviously use that offtake for their own transition and helping them then to create work as well via beneficiation in their own jurisdictions, which can raise a few questions specifically as well. Why don't we do the beneficiation, or at least part of it, in some of those African countries? That's our backyard. We should be focusing on that.
Sure. And if we expand further, what informs the ability or inability for Africa to then value add and process their own minerals?
There's various restrictions in it because it's capital intensive. So let's start with that point. But if you are in a country where stability from a monetary and fiscal policy point of view, geopolitical, stability, if we have that firstly, you have a commodity that's in demand, you know where the offtake is going to go to, and we can at least fund a portion of that beneficiation within the boundaries of the country. That will just help the country from an economic growth point of view, of communities having jobs, and then that by itself can lead to a lot of stability.
Sure. You actually preempted my question just after that, touching on policy, regulation, but more importantly, stability. In your work, as you continue to position Africa on the global stage, it is difficult to ignore some of the geopolitical tensions that are happening. We know since the inauguration of President Donald Trump, various decisions have been made which has placed the global economy in a precarious or fragmented position. When we zero in your role in terms of climate financing, what are some of the ways you are navigating these changes?
Look, it's a complex environment that we are dealing in. However, if I look at the geographies that is really wanting to come into Africa, it's clearly the European environment. The Middle East is becoming more active and want to become more active in Africa. The China will always be around, and India. So I don't think Africa can be ignored even by the US. And when I say that, where's the biggest opportunities for the energy transition? How many people on the African continent do not have electricity? So, just the end product of solar or wind turbines, depending in which area you're in Africa, that must create a lot of opportunities for many corporates sitting outside of Africa wanting to create electricity and obviously earning, revenues from that. However, the inputs into those transition or alternative energy sources definitely sits on the Africa continent. So how are we managing that? We have to make sure that we understand who's the players coming into Africa. And even if that includes, for example, US, China, India, Middle East, etc., we need to be comfortable within the boundaries of the country. We need to be comfortable with those countries, firstly, which we are. Again, Africa is our focus area, and we need to ensure that we look after Africa.
Sure. Shirley, I don't want you to say I'm harping on specifically this one question, but when we look at it in terms of a funding perspective, we know that Trump has instituted the cutting of the funds specifically for backing South Africa's energy transition. I want to say, what is the real-time impact in terms of that? We know that the energy needs in South Africa needs an all-hands-on-deck approach. And I don't think we're in a position to say some funding is funding that we can do without. What is the real-time impact from your organization on that?
If I look at the activity from our electricity provision point of view, we've seen our IPP office doing an enormously fabulous job in creating the whole renewables program. And we know we're sitting on 1 to 7. We're seeing battery storage happening, and there's clearly the gas to power project that is also being put into motion to ensure that we have baseload going forward. The impact of any funding cuts coming through to South Africa and the rest of Africa literally just means that we have to find alternative sources. If we look at the activity, once again, from multiple jurisdictions into Africa, we have seen the US playing a lesser active role on the continent. And again, if I look at the renewable programs, we've seen many European and Middle East players coming in. We've seen the EPC contractors coming also more from the Far East coming in, as well as the Middle East coming in. There's a very few contractors coming out of the US environment coming in, but they are there, but it is not as the multiples as from the East, for example, and Europe. So we need all the funding, and hopefully with us having access to that critical minerals and metals, that will ensure a different source of funding coming through, albeit it not necessarily be directly in the transitioning as an end result where electricity is produced, but maybe in the value chain before that.
I get a sense that the world seems to be vying for Africa, or they want a piece of the African pie, but also just take into account these opportunities that are at our disposal as a continent. What are some of the strategies in place to future-proof African mining for long-term growth?
There's definitely a few things needed for future-proofing Africa. I think the infrastructure to beneficiate the minerals and metals, or partly at least, within the boundaries of the country. I think as and when it's needed to be exported, the infrastructure, in other words, the rails, the logistics to move it to ports, and obviously enhancing ports, going to be very important. And clearly the energy usage, what type of energy is being used to obviously extract the ore from the various mines, that is going to be very important. If we're talking about a transition, the extraction of minerals must definitely happen in a much greener way. And that then will also help that the transition is happening quicker. And because we've seen as well, whoever wants to invest into Africa is looking at sustainability. So if you can prove, and I'm using an example of iron ore, if you can prove that the ultimate end steel product comes from a greener, ore body, that already will help Africa in obtaining more revenue.
Well, it is undeniable the role of Africa in achieving a cleaner and greener world, but surely we could go on for the rest of the day just talking about the limitless opportunities, but that's unfortunately where we have to wrap up the episode. And this is where I'd like to thank my in-studio guest, Shirley Weber, Managing Principal and Coverage Head for Resources and Energy Sector at Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, for joining me today to share her insights on the future of green energy. From me, Gyama Mosipele, and the rest of the CNBC Africa team, it's goodbye for now.